Hello and welcome to Gender Nebulous Series 3, Episode 1. It's been a while since we've been doing any podcasts, and I'm really happy to have a new guest, special guest, Barry Boffy MBE. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you. I know we've kind of bumped into each other a couple of times at various events over the past couple of years, and you've always kind of made me realize that there are people out there who are really kind of keen and have a lot of knowledge around diversity, equity, inclusion, equality. So I'm really happy that you're the first guest of the third series.
Thank you. I feel very honored to be the first guest. No pressure at all, obviously.
No pressure, no. So let's just start with, you used to be an employee of the British Transport Police. You're head of DEI there.
That's correct, yeah.
I know you're no longer with them. You're now with FAIRER, a company which specializes in DEI consultancy, and you are a DEI consultant with them. But could you just tell us, how when you were working with the Transport Police, how did you kind of get into that role, and what was your kind of responsibilities in that?
Oh, it's a very long story. Yeah, very big question. I'll try and keep it succinct. I actually started my diversity, equity, and inclusion career in the private sector, so 25 years ago nearly, for PwC and EY. And my role there was kind of HR focused, but looking at global mobility. So, international assignments, working across borders, across the globe, dealing with things like cultural awareness training, and supporting individuals as they come in and out of the UK and sending them overseas. So actually, I started diversity, equity, and inclusion a long, long time ago. After that, I went in to work for a medium secure forensic psychiatric hospital, which is a bit of a mouthful. It was meant to be a short period of time, but I ended up staying there for about 3.5 years or so. I found it deeply fascinating, the way that we kind of criminalize mental ill health, and some of the kind of mental health support infrastructure in the UK, which is a conversation for another podcast entirely. But it kind of got me really interested in that kind of criminal justice and kind of social and criminal injustices in particular. And then an opportunity came about for me to join British Transport Police. And it wasn't in a diversity, equity, and inclusion role at all. But it was a environment I never thought I'd end up in. I had no desire to work in policing, ever. And the reason for that was I grew up in the 80s and 90s, very much as a kind of as a gay man in the closet, in a very kind of prejudiced environment. I think that's the only way you can describe the 1980s and the early 90s, particularly for the LGBTQ plus community. So policing for me was seen as something that wasn't for me. It's certainly not an aspiration that I should aim for. But it came along. I thought it sounded interesting. I didn't know anything about BTP as a police service, so I don't know how I got through the interview. But there was an opportunity for me to join as a corporate services manager, which was looking at supporting the estates, the infrastructure, the weaponry, the kind of people related issues across Wales, the West Midlands and the southwest of England. But because of my background in diversity, equity and inclusion, I'd already had kind of relatively kind of successful career in that area. I felt ended up being tapped for information and support over and above the day job at BTP. So things like creating an independent advisory group for the West Midlands, for example, which was in my wheelhouse area of expertise. And eventually, after 7 years, there was an opportunity for me to kind of step into the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion role at BTP. And I was there for 7 years before I left in 2022. So that was a long version of the how I got there, but really fascinating environment. And
I can imagine,
but
yeah.
yeah, particularly eye-opening for me because there's always this perception that, and particularly with conversations at the moment in the press and in the public eye around, you know, policing and their inability to adapt to a diverse community. I think that's probably the best way of putting it. It's still quite prevalent. So there's always this perception that policing is quite backwards when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And fascinatingly enough, when I joined BTP in 2007, that force already had a transitioning at work policy in place.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
that's incredibly early for any organization. I'm still having conversations now with organizations that don't have any
Yeah, I
such
mean, there's
thing.
still large organizations who don't have that even
Exactly.
today.
So I
Yeah.
I walked in 2007 and that existed already. So
Wow.
I knew that they were a bit more kind of, I don't like to use the term progressive, but forward thinking in how it engages with
Mhm.
vulnerable, minoritized, underrepresented communities in particular. And had clearly been doing a lot of work in that area for some time. So it was enlightening. And that's why I stayed for 15 years. It actually wasn't what I expected it to be. Definitely like any workplace, lots of different people with different perspectives and opinions. But actually, in a policing context, the vast majority, and I do mean the vast majority, are there for the right reasons. They're there to support people. They want to do the right thing. They want to catch the baddies, catch the
Yeah.
criminals, stop people doing bad things, and support the vulnerable. And that's what I loved about policing.
And it was during that period when you were working for, the police that you won an Inclusive Companies and Diversity Champion award in
Yeah.
2018. Was that related to the work you were doing?
It was actually, yeah, it was specifically related to some of the work that I'd done, particularly with the trans and gender diverse community.
Mm.
Our force, alongside some kind of partners, were the first police services to go to Sparkle, for example.
All right.
And I remember
The one in
attending.
Manchester.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I remember attending my first Sparkle in 2008, which again was quite a long time ago and quite early for police services to actually be at that event. Not in a policing way, so we weren't there to police the event, but we were there to kind of engage with the community, find out, what the concerns and issues were. And over time that allowed us to develop kind of trans inclusive support infrastructure. Effectively, we were again working on the railway network, the police service that put in place things like trans-friendly train services to and from Sparkle with enhanced kind of police presence and
Well,
officer
I
police
wasn't even
presence.
aware of that. That's
Yeah,
that's
so and that started, I think, in 2009 or 10. So again, every year since, very much kind of worked in partnership with Sparkle to put these additional services in place for people traveling from Leeds, from Birmingham, from different areas, and marking out specific services that were trans friendly.
and
So
they would have
enhanced.
extra staff on them to take care of any
Exactly.
issues.
And informed staff as well. So it's not
Mhm.
just extra police officers.
No, it's
Police
people who've
officers have
had
really
training.
understood, yeah, the kind of trans and gender diverse community. So the award in 2018 was kind of connected to that in some respect, the work we'd already started, but I very much kind of picked up and ran with when I took on the role.
And you also have an MBE, which must have been a very exciting moment in your life.
A shock,
A
I think
shock, yeah.
the only way to describe it. Yeah, certainly something I would never have expected.
And that was
Uh,
your contribution to diversity inclusion
In policing,
in
yes,
policing, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So specifically to the work that I've been doing, and I know, having seen the citation, it was around particularly supporting, for example, vulnerable communities through COVID, and the work I'd done again with the trans and gender diverse community. So I was particularly proud of that, particularly as it came at the end of my policing career. But
Yeah.
recognition, I think, of not just me, the people that I was working with who were very much kind of, looking for that. How do we support these vulnerable communities? What can we do more to make sure that we are, a safe place for people to come to? And we know through the kind of trans and gender diverse community that policing is still not seen as that safe space. It should be, but it's still not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still a lot of work needs to be done in that area with policing and,
Mm.
how it can be more inclusive and, address some of the issues that we've seen over the past couple of years with certain things. I mean, doing great work, but I think still a long way to go from,
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I can't say that, I've changed policing
no,
in its entirety. I hope I've made a little bit of a dent, but
I'm sure you
there
have.
is always going to be more work to do.
So did you leave the police? Was it 22 when you left?
That's correct. Yeah.
And then you moved over to FAIRER.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I joined FAIRER Consulting in July of 2022, which is an environment I never thought I would work in. Again, that kind of consulting environment. I
Mm.
never wanted to be a consultant. That wasn't certainly something I had aspirations for. But what I found fascinating about FAIRER Consulting is the opportunity to work across with organizations who cover the globe effectively. So, worldwide organizations, Europe-wide organizations, lots of different kind of cultures and subcultures and things to be considerate of, particularly in the way that that those kind of different cultures work together. And we offer inclusion solutions, I think is the best way to describe it. So no matter what the need is from an organization, we will go in there and we'll design a solution and apply that with them. And it's always in partnership with them. So we
Yeah.
don't parachute into an organization, kind of produce a product and then parachute back out again.
So
Quite proud of our ongoing relationships.
do you go into these companies and do a kind of an assessment of where they're currently up to?
Sometimes, yeah, yeah. With most organisations that I've worked with at Fairer Consulting, it does involve that initial kind of audit and gap analysis.
Yeah.
Kind of go, what have you done? What are you trying to do? What are your aims and objectives? And where are your sticking points? So, why aren't you achieving what you want to achieve? Do you understand, who you should be engaging with? And are you engaging with those people? I think is generally the
Yeah.
question.
I mean,
Yeah.
that comes into one of the topics we were going to talk about, which is,
Mm.
DEI, diversity. I call it equality through equity and inclusion. I'd just like to read out to you kind of what I think of as the definition for diversity, equality, equity and equality and inclusion. So, diversity, the degree of difference among groups of people, such as ability, age, ethnicity, gender identity, health, language, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status.
Mm.
And then equity and equality, the promotion of justice, impartiality, and fairness. Equity is a process, while equality is the outcome. Equity is the necessary condition to be filled to achieve equality.
Hmm.
And then for inclusion, inclusion in a sense of belonging where individuals feel respected and valued for who they are. Inclusion ensures that people belong to and engage in and are actively connected to the goals and objectives of the whole wider society. So those are my kind of like what I consider to be the kind of definitions. Hopefully that's kind of aligns with what you would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say ditto. I don't have anything different to say around each of those areas, and I think diversity, equity, and inclusion as a concept or as an area of work is really misunderstood. It's ultimately about people,
Yeah.
and we have to remember that people are different, and it's not just about those kind of identities that people have, or those intersectional identities like race,
Mhm.
ethnicity,
Yeah, yeah.
sex, gender, whatever it might be. It's also about the cultural impacts, the kind of societal impacts as well, how people like to work. And we're not talking about neurodiversity or that kind of neurotypical or neurodiversity binary. We just talk about everyone is different. So it's much wider than the kind of that, I don't like to say, the tick box of identities. It's
Mhm.
actually about the human at the heart of the conversation. And that's one of the things I've always described to people. My practice is very much human centered. I've got all of the kind of the framework around me, the infrastructure, the academia, the kind of the stats and all of the stuff that I need to do my job. But I never forget about the individual person at the heart of that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's really important when you talk about intersectionality, because if you take any individual, there will be, a lot of intersections or, different characteristics that each person has. So
Mm.
I mean, you can't do it any other way, really.
No, and I think that's why it's really important that you do take that human-centered approach, because it's so easy for us to kind of, lump everyone together. The LGBTQIA plus community is this, and it's like, well,
Mm.
is it really? There's so many different kind of identities within that, as well as the
Yeah,
intersections of race, ethnicity, faith,
yeah,
belief.
exactly.
All of those kind of additional identities. So it makes it easier for us to kind of, assign a label to people, because then we kind of know who they are, in inverted commas. And of course we don't. We know an assumed version of who they are based on someone else's experience. So again, I could talk about that for forever, but
Yeah.
I find people fascinating.
So, I think one of the problems is that diversity, it doesn't really stop at diversity, does it? It's not just about diversity. You could have a lot of diverse people in a company, but then you might see them disappearing because the other things are not in place.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were very interconnected, if and that's one of the reasons why I think it's always wise to start with the inclusion first. So
Hmm.
inclusion and belonging is your kind of main aim, and it should be the first thing on any organization or individual's minds, because diversity is just statistics. It's just about the mix. It's just about, and it does end up kind of with people focusing on demographics, measurements, statistics. Our workforce is diverse, but is it cohesive? Is it respectful? Do people value difference in a
Yeah, do
way
you know,
that
do people feel included? I think that's a very important
exactly.
one.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, they really do kind of run together. I mean, much like anything, there's it's always kind of trends led. So
Yeah.
we're now having conversations about, well, should we be using DEI at all? Should we be talking about culture instead, as opposed to DEI? And I think to some extent that's as a result of some of the backlash, that kind of anti-woke, kind of
Yeah.
anti-DEI
Yeah.
sentiment that's happening at the moment.
Hmm. So, we talk about employee resource groups, and
Mm,
there's lots of different groups with different characteristics, different aspects of DEI. Um, but what I've experienced where I work is that there might be a lot of activity at the grassroots level, but it's not always represented at the top of the company. So, you've got this grassroots, things are being pushed up. We're trying to do change from the grassroots level,
mm.
but shouldn't it really be coming from the top down, or maybe both?
To be honest, it should be coming from the middle
The
out.
mid, okay,
And the reason I say middle out is that the vast majority of movement within an organization, so a move to a more inclusive environment, is dictated by middle management. It's not by leadership, and it's certainly not by people at lower grades in the organization who might be in a more activist role. It's those middle managers who control the business, who control what happens, how much focus is given to DEI. So I always say from the middle out. But ultimately, it can't just be one approach. It's not just the middle that's going to influence change. It has to also come from the top and be kind of informed by people's perspectives and lived experiences, which is where the activism in employee resource groups is really valuable. But there's a big chasm between the two. There's employee resource groups
yeah,
and the leadership, who are effectively dictating what is and isn't palatable for that organization, what it
yeah,
should or
because
shouldn't focus on.
we do see a lot of issues where, people at the grassroots level can, let's call them the activists, are trying to get something changed, and it ends up getting blocked by senior management because it's not in line with what the company thinks they should be doing in that area.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen quite a lot. It's very frustrating for the people trying to make change.
Mhm.
How do you
And
think
that's
we break down those kind of barriers? Because
it's
everybody's
it,
trying to do the right thing, but we kind of
yeah.
hit these barriers at different levels.
It has to be a partnership. It has to be a true collaborative partnership across the organization. And that might sound like a trite response, that, oh, that's easier said than done. But it's about the governance and the framework that's put
Mm.
around that. So what I find in my experience is a lot of employee resource groups are kind of permitted or generated by an organization in order to, I suppose, satisfy dissent rather than tackle the dissent itself.
Yeah.
So they're almost a tool to kind of not suppress, because that sounds too extreme, but to kind of placate a workforce that actually, look what we've given you. We've given you a black network, or we've given you an LGBTQ plus network. So your complaints are being listened to. But in reality, there's no connection between the two. And when we talk about partnership, it's about, and partly the employee resource groups have a lot of work to do in making themselves credible to the organization, because most organizations run on a hierarchy, and senior leadership generally listen to those people who are at their peers, at the
Mhm.
same level, at C-suite or board level,
Yeah.
or those people who are literally just underneath them. And then there's a very clear chain of command in most organizations. And when it comes to ERGs, they tend to be, not always, but tend to be kind of staffed by individuals who are at the lower grades of an organization. So those people who are quite young in service, who actually do see injustices, inequalities, inequities, and they want something to be done about it. And usually because of their own lived experience. And bridging that gap is all about what framework you put around that. So is there an actual kind of terms of reference? Is there an agreement in place? Do the employee resource groups actually have a seat at the board table? Do they have that opportunity to have that one-on-one conversation, which isn't kind of hierarchical in nature? It's more that opportunity to amplify what's going on in the organization, to platform, the issues that are being raised to them and through them, in a way that isn't necessarily banging a desk and demanding change. And I think that's where a lot of senior leadership feel ERGs are, that they are the people that will storm into an office almost like a union, banging a desk saying, this is absolutely outrageous, we demand change. And the
Mhm.
reality is most ERGs are not that at all. They want to work in partnership, but they just don't have that opportunity to be able to bridge that gap and have that seat at the table. So I don't think there's an answer there. I think if I had the answer, I'd be able to retire. But it's one of those things that it is about true partnership, and there has to be an element of that understanding, particularly from an ERG perspective, how the organization works, what is reasonable and what isn't.
Yeah.
Going in with a list of demands and they are singular in their nature, i.e., we want this and we're not going to accept anything less. You will have that natural kind of clash between leadership and the ERGs, because the leadership recognize that it can't be done for whatever reason, but the ERGs don't seem to understand why not. And that doesn't generate a healthy conversation.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying there is more of a collaborative approach.
Absolutely. It's got to be collaborative. And the ERGs, they should be working in partnership with the organization as critical friends. They are there
Yeah.
as employees of that organization in order to make the organization better,
So we're
not to
talking about
fight
mutually
against.
established goals and frameworks,
Absolutely, yeah.
collaboration to achieve, I guess, the agreed to list of improvements.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's I think the problem is getting your idea on that list, and seeing it through to change. I think that's where the frustrations come from the grassroots
And it
level.
can take a very long time, but it's
Changing
about
minds.
patience, changing hearts and minds,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you do have to be patient sometimes. Some of the things that you think are reasonable and easy to do may not be for whatever reason. You might
Mhm.
not understand what that reason is, but it's about kind of going, well, it can't be done now. Let's park it and we can revisit in 6 months, 12 months, 5 years' time. And recognizing that that's not a failure. It's just that constant dialogue that you are engaging with, in order to, again, it's boosting your credibility to leadership, to say you're
Yeah.
not going to stomp your feet or throw a tantrum because you didn't get what you want. That's the point where actually ERGs tend to lose a lot of trust in leaders, because they behave unreasonably to effectively things that can't be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. I have fallen into those traps in the past.
So have I.
I mean, it's an easy thing to do. Is this where, organizations like yours, like FAIRER, they can come in and kind of guide you through these kind of difficult parts of collaborating?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of that is about, talking to a whole organization. A lot of the work that we do is not just about engaging with that person who's commissioning us. It's about, well, who else in the organization can we talk to? We want to talk to a representative group of people across the entire organization at all levels, irrespective of whether they are passionate or not about DEI, because we want to get a sense of what the organization needs. And then we can help kind of guides that organization on who they should be engaging with. And the reason I say that is that the biggest mistake most organizations make is they forget about the vast majority of the organization who are bystanders or antagonists. So they are not actively involved in DEI. It doesn't impact on them on a day-to-day basis. And in most organizations, that's about 50 to 70% of the
Hmm.
organization. Now, if
Yeah.
you don't all engage with them, they're going to feel excluded. Inclusion never excludes. That's the one thing I say to most organizations, just remember this caveat, inclusion never excludes. You naturally will want to talk to your ERGs and your HR people and those people who get it already. They're bought in. But you need to talk to those people who don't get it, who don't understand why it's important, and actually in a way that they understand why this activity is important and that they're included in the conversation.
I mean, there's probably a lot of people who would say, this doesn't apply to me. Why are
Mhm.
you bothering me with this DEI stuff?
Absolutely.
But those tend to be the kind of people who maybe don't need some of the, inclusion activities because they're already, the majority, let's
Yeah.
say.
But they need to understand
They only need to
why
understand
others
why,
do.
yeah,
Yes.
why other it's needed for other people. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that, I
And
think
that's where you don't
that's
get buy-in. That's where,
yeah.
I see a lot of organizations that create a strategy and they've forgotten to talk to the whole organization, launch the
Mhm.
strategy, but then wonder why it doesn't work. It's like, well, actually, because 50 to 70% of the organization have never seen it before, don't understand it, don't
Yeah.
buy into it, and are not going to commit to this.
So
So it's not
how do
going
you
to.
how would you recommend, getting that 60-70% of people involved who may think it doesn't apply to them?
Actively seek them out. It's about not kind of going to your comfort level. So the people you know who you're going to engage with, actively seeking out those people who may be dissenting, who might be kind of quite vocal in their dissent. The what I call from my policing days, mess room warriors. Those people who've got a lot to say about DEI and
Mm.
usually in a negative
Usually
way.
negative. Yeah.
But they're the people I want to talk to. It's like, well, tell me why. To explain to me. But it has to be a dialogue. It can't be that kind of directive conversation of you must buy into this. It's more understanding where they're coming from that you can then better understand how you can respond to that in creating a strategy that's going to work for them. Because again,
So what you're
yeah,
saying is get them on board and make them own it as well.
yeah, even if at the end of that conversation they still don't believe in it, because you won't change everyone's hearts and minds all the time, but at least they'll understand why it's not potentially as discriminatory, impactful, exclusionary as they might initially think.
Hmm.
And that's what we find with the majority is that actually this doesn't involve me. So
Yeah.
there's a whole group of people that aren't me or like me who are getting something more. They're getting an advantage. They're getting something specifically for them, and I get nothing. In reality, if you go back to that caveat I said earlier of inclusion never excludes, they should still be included in this activity because inclusion is about everyone, not just what might be tagged the diverse group of people. Well, everyone is diverse. It's
Yeah.
100% of the organization.
And I guess the worst case scenario is that they'll still learn something.
Of course. Yeah. That exposure to it. And
Yeah.
actually that acknowledgement that I'm being listened to. That's
Mm.
sometimes enough for people to kind of go, I've spent 5 years moaning about this, and someone's actually prepared to listen to my complaints. Fantastic. I'm a bit more bought into it now. I still don't necessarily agree, but I'm a bit more, you're listening to me. I'm not being actively excluded.
And then we have different ERGs for different things.
Mm,
The LGBTQ plus ERG, or one for disabled people. You know, I feel as though these ERGs need to collaborate more as well
absolutely.
because you get a lot of ERGs working on similar issues. They just don't talk to each other.
And to be honest, it creates that sense of isolation,
Mm.
and segregation. Actually, it's a bit self-segregating for a network to kind of only focus on, I suppose, the headline issue. So, for example, an LGBTQIA plus network might only be focused on sexual orientation, gender diversity, or transgender issues, and in reality, they're forgetting about the faith and the religion and the
Yeah.
cultural backgrounds and all of those kind of things that make each of those people in that group different. So
Mhm.
it's too narrow a field. So if alone, it's understanding the intersectional nature of people. But you're right. I think a lot of networks are very kind of
I mean,
guilty of
they're focused on their own
singular
mission.
focus. Absolutely. And if you work collaboratively, it's, problem
Yeah, I
halved
mean,
is a problem.
you could almost say that let's do away with all these different ERGs and let's just all work together on the same, issues?
Actually, to be honest, I do agree in some respects. It depends on the maturity of the organization,
Yeah,
but
I
I
think it
think
would take a
yeah,
very mature organization to get to that point.
absolutely. I have seen it work very well where actually they don't have kind of singular networks for specific kind of identities or groups of people. They've got a working group where everyone kind of comes together and collaborates, and they might still have their main focus on sexual orientation or gender identity, but they're part of a bigger kind of uh, collaborative conversation.
That can
That
see related issues from different groups and work on them together.
exactly
Mm.
right. Yeah. So it does work, but for organizations that might be starting this for the very first time, that might be a step too far initially. It's about addressing those very specific concerns of specific people. And that's where networks are very good at kind of being able to kind of, accumulate those issues and have the power, as long as they're supported right, to be able to present them correctly to the organization as a way of holding up the mirror.
Yeah, and then if we kind of move on to the topic of allyship,
Mm,
and because this is a podcast about trans issues and non-binary issues,
yeah.
so I'm kind of interested in allyship, related to LGBTQ plus issues. How do we encourage allyship in people who, may not be or aren't LGBTQ plus?
It's quite a tricky conversation, to be honest. And I think allyship is it's always about curiosity. So one of the things that where I approach my allyship, and it's not just about allyship to the LGBTQIA plus community, it's about allyship to all groups, all different groups and identities, is about being curious
Hmm.
and entering into a conversation where I recognize I don't have the answers and I'm not there to win an argument. Now, that's the only way you can really kind of set yourself up as a true ally in being able to be open enough to understand that I don't have the answers. And I need other people to tell me about their experience, whilst recognizing that that's not the experience, but it is their individual experience. So there's lots of kind of caveats in that about what makes a good ally. But the kind of being curious is really important. I will always kind of encourage people to listen first, actively listen. Almost forget what you think you know about a community if you kind of going in to have that conversation with the community for the first time and just allow them to talk. So actively listen to their experience, their concerns, without bringing in an agenda to that conversation. And to that end, when talking about agenda, I do still see allies who see it as a bit of a gold star, like on their report card.
Yeah.
And the motivation behind being an ally isn't about you. And my allyship is not about me. It's about the people that I'm providing a platform for, or amplifying the voice of, or listening to and learning from. It's always about that community. It's never about me. And that's something I would always encourage people to go in with. This isn't a kind of gold star moment. It isn't, your opportunity to get your bonus at the end of the year by putting at the bottom of your email that you are an LGBTQIA plus ally. There needs to be substance behind that about what are you actively doing, how are you learning about a community that maybe you're not part of. And I do the same. I'm a cisgender male. I identify, my pronouns are he, him, but I've always been deeply curious about the gender diverse and trans community because of my own lived experience. I met
Yeah.
someone when I was 16 in 1991 on the gay scene who was trans. And it was someone that I'd never experienced before. It was a community I didn't know anything about. I was 16, it was the early 90s. So there wasn't much kind of positive representation there.
Yeah.
And I went into that conversation with the let me learn from you. Tell me about your experience, but being respectful in that curiosity. It
So,
has to be, a invited conversation rather than an interrogation.
so you see it more as a listening and learning and being open to, other people's experiences and how they, live their lives.
It's one of the requirements of being an ally, but actually allyship is more active than that. It's about, well, what can I do?
So,
Because
so you're
yeah.
also talking about like sticking up for people,
Yeah,
supporting people,
I think, yeah, and making change where you have the privilege to
and
do
where
so.
you've got the privilege to do something that they can't, you do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Providing platforms for people where I know I've had that opportunity to be able to kind of enhance the voices of trans and gender diverse people. I will give that opportunity to people readily. It's not,
Yeah.
again, about me. It's about this is your
I've
opportunity.
heard it described as, helping to open doors and
Yes.
leaving the door open for other people to follow in afterwards.
Yeah,
Opening the door for
absolutely.
others, reaching down to others
And
who maybe don't have your privilege.
I agree, and I think there's something slightly controversial I'm about to say, maybe controversial,
Okay.
in that I feel that allies who don't belong to that community are often seen by others who are outside that community as a safer entry point to the
Yeah,
conversation.
it's possible. Yeah.
And that's, having had, when I worked in policing, having had conversations with senior leaders in policing, um, I was able to kind of go into that conversation without bringing my lived experience into it because I don't have any lived experience of being gender diverse, but I'm informed. And I
Mhm.
have worked with the trans community for 30 plus years now. And to them, there's an element of safety there because they know that if they get something wrong, that I'm not going to react in a way that's, affecting me personally. So that there's that lack of nervousness in having a conversation. Whereas I know if I before brought kind of trans people or gender diverse people into a room with senior leaders, the conversation is stilted, it's quiet, it's nervous.
Yeah,
People
I
don't
think
want to ask questions.
I mean it's a good point you raise. I think even in that situation, you're still breaking down barriers, you're still opening doors,
Absolutely.
but you're kind of doing it one step removed.
Yeah. And it's about
And
bringing
and
people
it
with
will
me.
lead to, full interaction with everybody, hopefully.
And it does. That's the intention. Absolutely. It's
Yeah. I
about
mean, I would
me
support
opening the
anything that
door.
has that as its goal.
Yeah.
As long as we get there in the end, that's the important bit, isn't
I'll open the door and walk away. Once the door is open,
it?
it's up to those people. I'll happily
Yeah.
hold hands, for people if they're on that journey, but it's not for me to walk through that door. I've kind of
Right.
created the opportunity.
Yeah. So we're getting to the end of our time here. I've got my eye on the clock. And there's a couple of interesting facts about you, Barry. And I think that the first one was you were the person who was on the TV who'd missed the train, or the train got delayed on the way to the Queen's funeral.
I was, and I will have to say, it wasn't that I missed the train or the train was delayed. It was that all the trains were cancelled. So
Was there a bad storm on that?
there was a
Was there?
line failure effectively on
So there's
the
power lines
entire
down.
main line.
Mhm.
And I'd got on the train about 4:10 in the morning. So I was going to be there very super early. I'd traveled from Germany the night before to be there, obviously, because it's a real privilege to get that invitation to go to
Yeah.
the Queen's funeral. And halfway along the journey, the train stopped and we stayed there for a good hour
And
and
it
a
wasn't
half
going
and
anywhere.
it wasn't going anywhere. And, two very nice people on the train recognized where I was going because I had that conversation with them and actually threw me in a taxi with them and, got me to London as quickly as possible on a taxi. Bearing in mind, this was a good hour and a half. By the time I got to London, it was too late. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I can imagine the traffic and the whole congestion around everything that was going on would have been
And the
impossible to get there.
security,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I got there at the point where they said there's no point where you're not going to get there on time. So very disappointed.
Disappointing. Then you had to make your way home.
I did. Yeah, very despondently
But
after, the efforts of trying to get there.
and the other fascinating thing about you is that you have a hobby where you collect the autographs of supermodels.
I do, yes.
Tell me about that. I think that's really fascinating hobby. How did you get into that?
It's quite niche, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah,
It's not the sort of thing you'd think, oh, that's what Barry does. No.
I think it all came out of I turned 15 in 1990. So I was coming into an awareness of my sexual orientation as a gay
Mhm.
man. And at the same time, there was this explosion of the supermodels, with the
Yeah, yeah.
Naomi Linda,
Hmm.
1990, 91. And I was an avid kind of Vogue reader anyway. So I've always been kind of super fascinated by supermodels, by models, those kind of larger than life kind of
Yeah.
embodiment of what is supposed to be the perfect ideal of beauty at the time. And obviously it never is.
No.
But ever since then, I've remained kind of absolutely fascinated by modeling. So for the last 40 plus years or so, I've kind of kept abreast of what's going on in kind of trends, particularly in modeling, and obviously this move towards more diverse, more representative of the population, in size diversity, in ethnicity, in gender and gender identity. You know, there's lots of kind of very visible and kind
Yeah.
of trans and gender diverse models at the moment who
Yeah, there
are
are. Yeah.
at the top of their game, which is
Hmm.
absolutely incredible to see. And so I bought my first supermodel autograph about 25 or so years ago, probably a little bit longer, and it's become a bit of a obsession. So I'm a fair few hundred is what I'm going to say, is I've got, and I'm
So,
always
so do
having
you,
to it
do
every
you, do you
month.
buy these, or do you actually get the signatures from the individuals,
Well,
or
some
both?
are bought, and some are very kind models who
They'll
actually
send them
reach
to
out
you.
to me and send them to me.
Wow.
Yeah. Which
What a
I feel really
fascinating hobby.
privileged. But yes, like I said, a niche one, but
It
it
is
is my
niche, but it's very interesting. You have an Instagram account where you show some of these.
I do.
What's it called
Yes.
again? Your
It's a supermodel autographs.
yeah.
So
So
it's
there, give you a bit
quite
of
an
a
easy one
plug.
to remember. Thank you.
So anyway, I mean, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat about these topics. It was really interesting.
No, you're
Great to
very
see you
welcome.
again.
Lovely to
Um,
chat.
yeah, thanks. And to anybody watching or listening this episode, please, if you liked it, please subscribe. Please come back. There'll be another gripping episode coming along soon with another fascinating guest. So we'll see you next time. And thanks again, Barry. It was really nice talking to you today.
Thank you.